Hi everyone, today we'll be continuing with our lessons on the Korean War. Now, thus far we already would have covered what happened in the aftermath of World War II, which led to tensions worsening in Korea, and also the Cold War context, which sort of marks the Korean War. Remember, I've told you we need to understand the Korean War as a conflict which is happening um, against the context, the backdrop of the Cold War. Alright, and we're going to zoom in all the more into that today because we'll be looking at the idea of whether the Korean War can be considered a proxy war or a civil war. Alright, so what we'll be doing during today's lesson is as follows. We are going to examine the reasons for the outbreak of the war in itself, and then we're going to evaluate the role of the superpowers and regional powers, namely the Soviet Union, the US, and of course China, as well as the three of them in local conflicts. Local conflicts, of course, in this case, the Korean War, meaning North and South Korea. Now, it's important to understand these two terms. Now, I would have explained this in brief in class already, but just to remind you again, you need to understand that a proxy war is a war instigated or basically started by one or more major powers without their own direct participation. So in this case, in the context of the Korean War, we're talking about the Soviet Union and the US, all right? And you can say China as well. Without their own direct participation, then the direct participation was taken, who took part in it directly? Of course, it was the two Koreas, North and South Korea. And the idea of a civil war means a war within a country between two or more groups within that country. Okay, so remember in class I gave you the illustration of fighting spiders. So it's something like how we would have, let's say, two powers, or in this case, let's say two mischievous boys who decide to have a competition with each other, a sort of a war, but rather than fight against each other, they each catch their own spider, and this spider of theirs acts as their proxy. Okay, so it's a proxy war engaged whereby they get their spiders to fight with each other rather than the boys fighting directly against each other. Okay, so that's the idea of a proxy war. And of course, a civil war means it's just a conflict within the country itself without any external involvement. So we are asking ourselves whether it really is more of a proxy war or a civil war. Okay. Now, it's important to understand, to appreciate the importance of the Korean War as being, as you can see, one of the most destructive wars of the 20th century, and importantly its situation, it being situated mere 5 years after the end of World War II. Alright, World War II ended in 1945, and by 1950 there already was this crisis. Okay, so it's the first international crisis since World War II whereby there was fighting, and it's marked by this internal division between North and South Korea. But importantly, it wasn't just North and South Korea on their own, but there also were Cold War tensions and involvement of superpowers. Okay, so remember I told you it's really important to understand that the Korean War is not a war on its own, isolated, but it is fought with the involvement of the Cold War superpowers, and their respective ideological rivalry was what helped to fuel these tensions between the two sides. Okay, let's now do some recap as to what was happening during the Korean War. Okay, now these are all stuff you should know, so I'm just going to zoom through this really quickly. Now, to trace the outbreak of the Korean War, you need to remember how initially, after World War II, so Japan had to relinquish control over Korea, and so it was divided. The northern parts of the north of the 30th parallel was under the Soviet Union, and the southern part was under American control. So the Soviets had withdrawn from the northern region, and Kim Il-sung's communist government was established, and his army, the North Korean People's Army, okay, grew even stronger. Later, late 48, the Soviet Union withdrew its forces and advisors, and Kim himself, Kim Il-sung, was set on unifying Korea under his government and communism. So you can see here the Soviet Union, representing the Soviet Union, and then China, and then North Korea. Now, this pretty much was mirrored in the South, with the American allowing of the establishment of Syngman Rhee's anti-communist government, Alright, following which, shortly after, the American forces withdrew. But importantly, note this proviso, this asterisk here. This withdrawal of troops took place before the Soviet atomic bomb was tested, and this was successfully tested in 1949. Now, you can imagine that if this had been done earlier, or rather if they had known about this, they may not have been so eager to withdraw, because of course this would mean that the Soviet Union would be less deterred by by the Americans, because the Soviet Union would have so-called drawn equal with them in terms of having an atomic bomb. All right, but anyway, the fact is that this happened before the atomic bomb. The Soviets had successfully tested their own atomic bomb, so the Americans withdrew, and only a few hundred troops were left in the southern region of Korea. So this is the mirror, okay, the parallel between the two sides. Both sides saw the withdrawal of their respective superpower troops and advisors, as you can see over here, okay. And importantly, you need to note that both superpowers did not initially intend to be heavily involved in Korean affairs, alright, and so they had given limited support, very limited support to North Korea and also to South Korea. However, we're going to see a contrast in terms of the nature of this limited support. Alright, basically, Kim Il-sung of North Korea, he actively sought Stalin's help to provide economic and military aid. And initially, okay, because again, as we said, they did not want, the Soviet superpowers did not want to get heavily involved in Korean affairs. Stalin was initially reluctant to help. However, right, the Sino-Soviet treaty helped ensure Sino-Soviet help to North Korea. Remember, we talked about this in class, how because China by this time had become the People's Republic of China, had a communist government, and later on the Chinese and the Soviets signed a treaty. So now the Chinese were willing to take on the lion's share, the main role of communist support of North Korea. Alright, and so this helped to ensure that North Korea had backing. And following that, Stalin changed his mind in 1950 after Dean Acheson's defense perimeter speech. If you recall, this was the one whereby Dean Acheson, he outlined the places which the US would be willing to defend against communism. He mentioned various places such as the Philippine Islands, the Ryukyus, and other Aleutian Islands, but he did not mention Korea. And so this, in this sense, was an encouragement to Stalin that the US would not take action if there was increased communist activity in Korea and a potential communist takeover of the whole of Korea, the Korean peninsula. So this encouraged him to change his mind. Alright? So this then led to increased support of North Korea. You can see here, right, the Chinese and North Korean soldiers were involved in the Korean War. Of course, the Chinese supported the North Korean soldiers who were involved in the Korean War, and they used Soviet weapons. And here another picture, right, there were Soviet soldiers in North Korea, still there, though in limited numbers. Okay, and so this helped the North Korean military to grow in strength, as you can see here. This is a picture of them today. If ever you are free, you should go and do a YouTube search of videos of the North Korean military marches. It's really quite an extraordinary thing to see what they do, and look at them, all these military officials laden with medals. Okay, basically this is meant to help illustrate the point that at that point in time, 1949 to 50, the northern military was far stronger than the southern one was. Okay, you need to have an appreciation and understanding of the great imbalance between North and South Korean military strength and capabilities, with the North being far superior to the South, even though both sides had a limited degree of support. Alright? That was the North. So how about for the South? Now similarly, the Americans and the other superpower also did not want to be heavily involved in Korean affairs, so they gave limited support to South Korea, but even less so than the amount of support which the Soviets had given the North. So you can see the main focus of the USA was on Japan, because remember, Japan also came under American guidance, American leadership in the aftermath of World War II, and they wanted to rebuild Japan to be a strong anti-communist ally. Alright, and so that was the focus of their efforts, to rebuild Japan to be a strong, economically viable power in East Asia, in the Asia Pacific. And therefore, Korea was not seen as as important. Alright, it was viewed more as a political and not a military problem. So in other words, they were not worried so much about a potential communist takeover, communist military takeover of the whole of the Korean peninsula, therefore for the north to attack the south. And they thought that economic rather than military assistance would be more effective. They also did not want to equip Ri with too many weapons to start a war. Ri was very hungry to go to war to reunify Korea, just as Kim was for the North to reunify Korea under a communist government. So was Ri eager to reunify Korea as well under his own government. But the US was not too keen on that. They did not want to give Ri the impression that USA would support his war. And therefore, that's why they did not want to give too much military support to Ri and South Korea. Now, why did they have the reservations with Ri? You can see here, he led a corrupt government, and he was an authoritarian leader, and he was growing increasingly unpopular among the people. Okay, importantly, you must understand that the reason why the US liked Ri is not because he was a good leader and a very wonderful figure, but more precisely and more because he was an anti-communist. He was a fierce anti-communist, and that's what they thought was the most important, more so than whether he's a good leader, so to speak, or not. Okay, in fact, he was suspected of many crimes against communists in Korea. You can see here some images from the quelling of the Jeju uprising. Basically, he's not exactly a good guy, in spite of what you may think. Okay, because he's a friend of the US. Remember, just because you're a friend of the US doesn't necessarily mean you are a good guy. Alright? And remember, let's talking about Dean Acheson's defense perimeters in the perimeter speech. Okay, so Korea was excluded from this speech. You can see here, Korea over here. It was not part of this perimeter, which is outlined over here in this line thingy. Thus, this encouraged Stalin and North Korea to take action to reunify Korea under communist rule. Right. So, prior to the Korean War itself, there were border clashes, several border clashes between South and North Korea. Okay, the most notable one was when you can see here the South Korean warships attacked North Korean military stations in the Taedong River, and it was this had a swift retaliation by the North Korean People's Army, and thus this showed that South Korea was unable to launch a successful offensive attack on the North, right? Because we learned it already was militarily much weaker than the North was. Having said that though, Ri was still intent on initiating border clashes, right? Which is why the US had their reservations about him and why they did not want to equip him with too much military strength in the first place, because they were reluctant to get involved in another war. But Ri was very much so. Okay. As I said, they were not keen to be embroiled in a war in Korea, and they weren't supportive of Ri's initiatives, and therefore reluctant to give in to Ri's demands for more weapons. And this made it even more attractive for the North to attack the South, and they were prepared to invade South Korea and gain a quick victory. At least they thought it would be a quick victory. So, in summary, the tensions between North and South Korea, and you have this in your handout as well, you can see, alright, it was due to competing ideologies in the two Koreas, anti-capitalism versus anti-communism, anti-capitalism in the North versus anti-communism in the South. Alright, added to that, there was the desire for unification. That was pretty much the only thing which the two Korea's leaders had in common. Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee both desired for Korea to be reunited, right? And both are willing to use force to do so. But of course, the nature of the government in their ideal united Korea was a very different one. There also was the partition of Korea and the alignment with different superpowers. We already talked about this. Okay, North Korea with the Soviets and the Chinese, and South Korea with the Americans. And I stressed this many times, you need to be aware of the military imbalance, whereby the North was really strong, whereas the South was really weak. Alright. Now, you can see that at the bottom of your slide. This is in the last slide of page 1. You can see this URL over here. Now, I advise you to go and visit it. Why? Because you will see there a good sort of narrated overview of what's happened during the Korean War and how one side gained the advantage over the other, and then there was a change in, one side gained the advantage, but then the other side took it back, and so on and so forth. Very much in what I would say is like in a W formation. If you can see my cursor here, all right, where the North went down to the South, and then the South with American aid went back to the North, and then it went down again with the help of the Chinese, but not so far down, but still fairly far down, and finally they ended up fighting to a stalemate and going a bit back up again. So it's almost like a W kind of shape, but then a tapering, a W which tapers downwards. Okay, I'll talk more about this in class if you don't have no idea what I'm talking about. All right, so another way to look at it, of course, is as a yo-yo war, going down and going up and going down again and going up again. So something like a W shape, right? Okay, so this was the nature of how the North had gained the advantage initially. That's why you can see the communist forces had gained the advantage, but then with the UN help, the South managed to push all the way back up near the Yalu River, but then China got involved, pushing all the way back down past Seoul again, past the 38th parallel. Finally they reached a sort of stalemate and moved around here for a long period of time, and they finally settled on the borders, which today also mark the border between North and South Korea. Here's just some pictures of the American side and how happy they were that the Armistice was signed. Now importantly, you can see here Armistice line, the DMZ, demilitarized zone. As I've told you in class, the Korean War, while the fighting was finished in 1953, even today technically the Koreas are still at war because there only has been an armistice. Hostilities have ceased, but not the war as a whole. So technically the war is still on. Okay? Yeah, so please do take note of that as well. Now it's important, again, we're looking at what led to the development of Korea from initially what was a conflict between North and South Korea to a proxy war. And so we need to look at evidence for the support of the various superpowers of their respective Korean ally. Excuse me. So in terms of Soviet support from North Korea's invasion, what evidence is there of it? Now firstly, if you recall, the Soviets had provided military support through weapons and of course moral support. They were fully behind North Korea, and that is a big thing because North Korea had the support of such a major superpower. Now additionally, the Soviets also provided the North Koreans with not just the equipment but also the training and advice, and of course the Soviets are very experienced militarily, so this was a big aid to North Korea. Also, just to show you, here are some pictures of the Korean War Memorial located in the National Mall in Washington DC. You can see here it says here, "We remember you forever." Okay, the South Korean and American flags. Now this memorial is quite an interesting place. If you ever have a chance to go to Washington DC, there are many very interesting and relevant memorials to what you've learned. Alright, and one of them is this Korean War Memorial. You can see here. Alright, yeah. Let me just read that for you. "One nation honors her sons and daughters who answered the call to defend the country they never knew and the people they never met." Alright, so this war is still very much commemorated by the survivors and the relatives of the survivors of those who fought in the Korean War, especially the Americans. Here another picture there. Now, in your textbook, you have this source here, and I want you to pay attention to this. This is showing what led to the entry of the US to support South Korea. If you see this, okay, South Korea is a small country thousands of miles away. Right? What is happening there is important to every American. So why so? You can see there, right? Okay, this attack by the North on the South has made it clear that the international communist movement is willing to use armed invasion to conquer independent nations. An act of aggression such as this creates a very real danger to the security of all free nations. So the Americans built themselves as defending all free nations, which is why Truman was trying to persuade, encourage the American people, the American Congress, to support the US going under the auspices of the UN, the United Nations, to support South Korea. Okay, you can see here another one. The attack upon Korea was an outright breach of the peace and a violation of the Charter of the United Nations. By their actions in Korea, these communist leaders have demonstrated contempt for basic moral principles on which the UN is founded. It's a direct challenge to the efforts of the free nations to build the kind of world in which men can live in freedom and peace. So this challenge has been presented squarely, which means very clearly to them, and we must meet it squarely. We must respond to it very clearly. So this is the American President Truman giving his case as to why the US should support South Korea. How exactly did the USA support South Korea in the war? Excuse me. You can see they did so partly through influencing the UN, persuading the UN that action needed to be taken to protect South Korea from communist aggression. All right, which is why actually the US involvement in South Korea was took place, as I said, under the umbrella of the UN, under UN auspices. That means it was a UN force, but of course mainly constituted of American troops. Now, they also supported South Korea as shown through NSC 68, which was a policy paper written by the US National Security Council. Basically, the US National Security Advisors, they put forth this paper, this write-up on how the US should respond to the communist threat. And basically, it talked about how it was important that for the US to be very firm and respond even with military support if necessary, should there be any conflicts which threaten the survival, basically threaten to have communism being dominant in the world. All right, and so after this was published, all right, it became very clear in 1950. It became very clear to the Americans that they would potentially be more than willing to use military force to help defend against communist aggression. All right, and so you can see here, okay, this banner over here. This is talking about how the United Nations fight for freedom, and very importantly, you can see at the top of there is the American flag. The US would be the main leader of the fight for freedom. Okay, of course, if you look very carefully, you can see here the Soviets as well. The Soviets also are members of the United Nations. So why is it that the Soviets, and they were a major member of the United Nations, why would they have allowed for the UN to get involved to help South Korea? Now we'll come to that in a short while. So basically, the US said that if the UN did not take a firm stand on Korea, the UN would lose credibility. That means people would no longer have faith in it. People would no longer think of it as a capable and a viable organization, similar to how the League of Nations had lost credibility following things like their response, or the lack of proper response, to the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, right, as well as the Italian invasion of Abyssinia in the 1930s. All right, similarly, the threat to the UN, what the US said was that the UN would lose credibility and then fail to protect nations from communism. So the USA mobilized the UN to condemn North Korea. Okay, condemn means basically to issue a harsh scolding of North Korea. And they also ordered North Korea to end hostilities and withdraw from South Korea. Okay, President Truman also called for the UN Security Council to employ the use of force against North Korea. All right, and later on, 16 member states, some of these among them, all right, contributed troops to help the UN force to help the South. Now, importantly, this UN Security Council, these 5 members have veto power. That means if one of them says no, then this action cannot be carried out. Now, these 5 members include the Soviet Union. All right, but the Soviet Union didn't say no. Why didn't they? Because they were basically at this point in time boycotting the Security Council, which means they were not even present at Security Council meetings. Why? They were unhappy that Communist China was not given a seat in the Security Council. All right, instead it was given to Taiwan, the Republic of China. All right, so they're not happy that their communist ally was not recognized in the UN, and so they boycotted the Security Council. But the issue with this is that this meant that there was no one to say no, no one to veto to stop the UN involvement in the force to help South Korea. Okay, and so the UN did get involved in the Korean War, led by General MacArthur. Okay, he's the same American general who had led the US occupation of Japan. All right, so he was in charge. General Douglas MacArthur was in charge, and very importantly, you need to take note that South Korean forces were extremely dependent on the UN forces. I put there UN bracket US because basically the main bulk, the backbone of the UN forces in South Korea were American. Okay, so what's happened, and remember I told you there's that, I showed you the link to that video you can watch. You can see for yourself how the Americans, MacArthur made this brilliant move, okay, to land in Incheon to help basically to surround the North Korean, the communist troops, okay, with a landing at Incheon. They made a daring amphibious landing over there. Amphibious means partly land, partly by sea, okay, and he landed a total of 261 ships and managed to push North Korean forces back, okay, push them back. So this was at the time after the North had overwhelmed the South and cornered them all the way until near the city of Busan, but now they were being pushed back. Alright, and this is when we have the involvement of China, okay, Chinese entry to support North Korea. So how did China support North Korea in the war? Basically, partly through its contribution not just of supplies but also of troops, a good number of troops, okay, and they also had sent an ultimatum. So they sent an ultimatum to the UN whereby their premier, Zhou Enlai, he warned that if the American forces crossed the 38th parallel, China would intervene in the war. Because remember, at this time, the South, rather the UN troops supporting the South had pushed the North Korean troops back from when they had pushed all the way to Busan, and now they even crossed the 38th parallel, which is where the original border between the two Koreas was supposed to be. Now China said that they would not hesitate to defend its border with Korea and even risk an all-out war. Okay, so what's happened? Even though they were threatening that, they secretly sent troops into North Korea regardless of whether the troops from the South and the UN forces would cross the 38th parallel, and which indeed they did, and this eventually surprised General MacArthur and his troops. Okay, and you must also remember, look at this picture here, the Chinese troops, really vast number, vast addition to the communist forces. So eventually a stalemate was reached. How was this so? Okay, remember initially the UN and the USA, they wanted to limit the war. Alright, they did not want things to be pushed even further, and in fact they were okay with just saving South Korea from communism. They did not want to engage China in war, as this would attract the Soviet Union into war as well, and they didn't want things to blow up too bigly, to blow up too much. Alright, well, unfortunately for them, the general in charge, General MacArthur, he wanted to carry on fighting, and he was willing to fight China if need be, which was pretty much a much more enthusiastic and much more daring and much more eager for war than the American government and Truman actually was. He even went against Truman's orders and pushed beyond the 30th parallel, which was, of course, that means it was threatened China, because China already said don't go beyond the 30th parallel or we will get involved, and in fact he didn't get involved, and as a result, well, he was fired. So that was the end of General MacArthur. But this basically led to a stalemate, because now both sides were equally matched enough such that no side made any progress much beyond the 38th parallel. So in the end, how then did Armistice come about? Remember, I told you in 1953 there was an Armistice. How did this Armistice come about? And this, of course, was facilitated by the superpowers. So they all participated, okay, the Soviets, the Chinese, the Americans all participated, and they put pressure on the two Koreas, which were more than enthusiastic to carry on fighting until Korea was unified. But the three superpowers, or were less enthusiastic, okay, and they even threatened to withdraw support for their respective Korean allies. So this, of course, was something which, if was done, both Koreas would, on their own, would be really very hard pressed to carry on fighting. Now, it was difficult to reach a resolution, definitely, as you can see, just like at the start with regard to how they wanted Korea to be unified. Both sides wanted different outcomes from the talks. Alright, so things, for example, like the division line, should it be at the 38th parallel or not? Prisoners of war, should we force them to be returned to us or not? Alright, these were some of the issues which they were faced with. Alright, and this was against the backdrop of stalled and prolonged fighting. Stalled means it would stop and then drag on for a long time, prolonged for over 2 years. Okay, now later on, President Truman, he was taken over by President Eisenhower, and this change of president did help to convince Syngman Rhee to accept an armistice agreement. Alright, with this change in leader of the US. Also, the threat of nuclear weapons helped to hasten the process, because everyone was worried that if prolonged fighting, in the end, nuclear weapons may get involved, and this would make matters even more catastrophic for both sides. Okay, so this also helped to hasten the process. Now, Stalin also passed away in 1953, and this also helped to convince Kim to accept an armistice agreement. He was replaced by Khrushchev. And similarly, the threat of nuclear weapons helped to hasten the process. So on both sides, you see some parallels, right? The change of leadership, okay, and this helped to persuade the leaders of the respective Koreas that, okay, going on fighting won't work, okay, because the new leaders may not be as supportive of carrying on the war as the previous ones were, okay, and this convinced them to accept an armistice agreement, okay, and so the borders were drawn. Even today, right, the borders between North and South Korea still are in existence. Alright, so this is something which I would like you to do. Okay, I'll talk more about this in class, so just take note of it for now. All I need you to do now is just to read these pages of your textbook. Okay, I'll elaborate on this later on. Also, there's a second thing which talks about completing the cheat sheet. Okay, don't worry about that, I'll pass you a cheat sheet at a later date. Okay, so I hope this lesson has been useful. If you're not sure, please do look for me in class or in school itself, so I can clarify things with you. Alright, thank you.